Welcome to today's webinar, Play to Learn, 9 Steps to Learning Game Design Success. So my name, once again, is Sharon Boller. I am the Director of Marketing here at Bottom Line Performance. I'll be your moderator for today's session. So as Sharon and Karl are sharing their insights with us on learning game design, I will be monitoring the questions that come in, sending out some links to play games, and just making sure that the session flows as we want it to. And I'm joined by Sharon Boller and Karl Kapp. Sharon, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Whether it's good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you. I am Sharon Boller. I'm the president of Bottom Line Performance Incorporated, and I am Karl's co-author on the book Play to Learn. Learning games are my particular passion, and I've been designing and developing them for a very long time. I'm biased, I know, but I feel like it's a very powerful and effective way to learn, and I'm eager to help other people learn how to develop them as well.
Great. Karl, go ahead.
Hey, I want to echo Sharon and thank everybody for being here. I'm a professor of instructional technology at Bloomsburg University in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, and have been working with Sharon for years delivering a workshop helping people to learn how to create learning games, and we've learned a lot from that process. We also have developed our own learning games, so we've learned a lot with that process, and are really excited to be able to share what we've learned over the years and the process that we use, and really to help raise the ocean, as they say, to everybody creating really awesome but instructional learning games. So thanks, Steve.
Awesome. Thank you, Karl. Thank you, Sharon and Karl, both for being here with us today. So like you guys heard, together Sharon and Karl authored the new book from ATD called Play to Learn, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that book throughout the session. The content that they're going to present to you today is going to be kind of a distilled version of the book, and the book is kind of a distilled version of that session that Karl spoke to, that workshop that Sharon and Karl have been giving for the last 4 years or so. So this webinar is part of our ongoing Lessons on Learning webinar series. We did several of them last year. We're doing a few of them this year. So our next session is going to be in June, and it's going to cover training reinforcement. We'll give you some more information on that topic if you're interested after the session. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sharon, who is going to start off our webinar today, give you the agenda, and kick off our content. So Sharon, take it away.
Thanks, Steve. Steve said this is a distilled version of the book. So we're going to basically intro by talking about the power of games and why Karl and I believe learning games are such a good choice as part of a learning solution. And then we'll kind of talk through the 9 steps in clusters. So we'll talk first about playing games and exploring and evaluating them. Then we'll talk about how you combine learning design and game design together to produce something instructionally sound. From there, we'll kind of move into prototyping and development of your game once you've designed it, and how you continue to iterate through that prototyping and development process. And finally, we'll talk about deployment of the game, because it's the step that most people tend to pay least attention to and give least amount of thought to. You can have a great game, but if you have a poor deployment, then it really wasn't a great game. So with that said, we kind of want to start out by talking or finding a little bit out about you. And Steve's going to bring up a couple of polls here so we can just find out who we have with us today. So the first poll helps us understand what your current level of expertise is in game design. So what would you say about yourself? Maybe you're just here, you haven't designed anything yet. All the way down to you could be teaching this webinar on our behalf this afternoon because you have designed and developed so many games. Where do you fit on that continuum?
All right, I'm going to share those results. There we go.
Okay, so it's a pretty nice mix. We have a small percentage who have either developed them frequently already or could take Karl and I's spot. And then we have a bigger number who just started or haven't done anything yet and are waiting to get going, and a couple who've gotten their toe in the water. So the other thing we want to know about you is what kinds of games have you been creating? So we have a second poll that lets us know, have you been doing stuff primarily that we call tabletop, which would be board games, dice games, card games? Have you been doing primarily digital games, or are you doing both? We'll give you a few seconds to kind of speak to those. And the good news is that regardless of which type you're doing, the process works the same way. So the 9 steps that Karl and I are going to talk to you about this afternoon or this morning or this evening, whichever your time zone is, apply to either type. Okay, so awesome. A lot of you are focused primarily on digital, small but strong contingent for tabletop, but a lot of you also want to do both types, which is great. At Bottom Line Performance, we definitely do both types, and I would say we probably do them both equally. We do a lot of things for live workshop style events, and then we also do quite a few digital games as well. So that gives us a good sense of who we're speaking to. And Steve, I'll let you bring back the slide, and we'll get started. So I usually start my discussion with trying to get people to think a little bit differently. Frequently, I'll get the question, and I know Karl has gotten the question, so when are games the best choice within a learning context? And I like to tell people, try asking a different kind of question. Instead of asking when games, ask which kind of games. Because games can be useful in a wide array of learning arenas. I have done games for 300 people in a very large-scale conference-style environment. I've also done tabletop and board games that take 2 or 3 hours for people to play through. I've done games that take 17 seconds as part of kind of a illustration or opener. And then we have definitely done a lot of digital games that can be done on the desktop or on a mobile device, etc. It's all about your context and your need. So thinking in terms of which kind of game you might use is often more helpful than deciding, should I use a game at all or not? With that in mind, how would you define a game? I will share a definition with you, but I'd love to hear you respond using the chat or question window as to what you would define a game as being. Okay, and I'm seeing someone say something that challenges the learner, something that includes interaction, and someone said competition and fun, something that provides immediate feedback, engaging, I'm seeing that word come up a few times, something that's out of the norm, that's interesting, risk and reward. So lots and lots of different ways of thinking about games. I've seen rewards, I've seen rules. But here's my definition. It's the one Karl and I both use in the workshop. So we agree with the idea of a goal or a challenge, that it's an activity that has some sort of explicit goal or challenge to it. It needs to have rules, and it can be rules just for the player. It could be for the player in the system if you're dealing with computer games. There needs to be some type of interactivity, and that goes to the engagement that I've heard seen several of you push through in your chat. It's either mental interactivity with other, with the game environment, it's interactivity with other players, and oftentimes it's with both. Feedback mechanisms are always part of a game. They provide that player with a clear cue on how you're performing. It's part of what makes them such a powerful learning tool. And a game will result in a quantifiable outcome of some sort. There's a win state, a lose state, a hitting of the target, or a success at the challenge. And oftentimes it will trigger an emotional reaction. And that's what so many folks refer to as fun. But a game doesn't actually have to be fun in the ha-ha, I'm entertained, enjoying myself sense. It can be fun in the aspect of it's really mentally challenging me. And that's something to think about as you're thinking about learning games. So if that's what a game is, let's now think about how people actually learn something and remember it. So the first thing that's required to learn anything is motivation. And it's a mistake to think that the game itself will be sufficient motivation for people, but often the challenge within a game motivates people. The idea of trying to hit that goal or that target or overcome that challenge can be very motivating to people. Relevant practice is required for us to learn. So while I would love it if you could all be amazing game designers after our time here this afternoon, the truth is you won't be until you actually practice creating learning games. And that's what the book's awesome for, because it takes you through in workshop style this practice process of creating games. We also need specific timely feedback in order to learn. So we can practice, but if no one ever tells us what we're doing well and what we're doing poorly, it's very difficult to learn. We need spacing and repetition, and that spacing and repetition goes to the remembering. So I can learn something, and maybe I have the afternoon workshop or a day's workshop with Karl and me. You get to practice making a game, and we give you feedback, and then you never go and create another one. You're probably not going to get better, and you're not going to remember what it was you learned in that workshop. And optimally, story is a very powerful remembering tool for us. It's much easier for us to remember things in the context of a story, partially because it triggers emotion with us, than it is to remember just statistical facts or facts and figures. So all of those things work together to enable us to have an ability to retrieve something later when we need to use it on the job. Now here's how games link to that learning. And I've already kind of given you a sneak peek when I talked about the game goal or challenge can provide some motivation and emotion for us. Competition, while not necessary for a game, because games can be cooperative or competitive, that competition with either the game itself, where we're all working together to overcome a challenge or achieve a goal, or against other players, can provide an incentive or a motivation for us to want to play, as can other elements that are often included in games, such as levels, rewards, resources, the story itself. Those all can provide motivation. We need relevant practice, and games make a nice, strong connection between the in-game challenges and the things we do to achieve it and the practice we might need in the real-world skill that we're trying to build. Games provide ample feedback. Just by their design, they're designed to provide feedback continuously as to how you are doing in the game. And the impact of the choices that we make in the game influence how well or poorly we're doing, and we can adjust our behavior to try and do better. Spaced repetition can come through different levels of play, the opportunity to replay. All are more powerful and motivating to us than perhaps simply rereading something or re-going through flashcards or whatever the other learning activity might be. And finally, many games include story with them. They include a narrative, they may include characters. That's not true of every game. If I think of Scrabble, there's no story or even theme to Scrabble, but we can still find it a compelling experience. But when story is involved, it tends to heighten the learning experience. So with that said, how do you create games that actually help people learn? And the 9-step process that Karl and I advocate starts with playing games and evaluating what you play and exploring learning games. So that's where we're going to start here this afternoon. These pictures are all of people who work at Bottom Line Performance, and they're playing a variety of games. We do this on a weekly basis. We pull out different games, digital games, tabletop games, etc. And you'll notice that there's 2 circles there, red circles on the image to the right. Those are game evaluation worksheets that we consistently use as we play games, so we can think about what we're playing and how game elements within it might be incorporated into a learning game. And you'll note that you see all kinds of games here. So it's not enough to just play games you would naturally gravitate toward or that appeal to you. It's important to play a wide variety of games and think about what makes those appealing to the learners or the players that they're targeted to. With that in mind, I kind of want to know, what's the last game that you played? If playing games is the first step to becoming a good learning game designer, what's the last game you played? Jeopardy, Ticket to Ride, one of my favorites. Plants vs. Zombies, another favorite. Pandemic, excellent game. Temple Run, love that game as well. Code Word, love that. Notice in the chat window as people are sharing these, tons and tons of different kinds of games. Apps on their phone, I have lots and lots of those. Cards Against Humanity. So I'm seeing that people play a lot of games. That is awesome. How many times a month would you say that you play a game? I'm getting 3 to 5, 10, daily. So you're the right kind of people to be designing games. Now, those of you who are saying 0 or maybe once or twice, you might want to step up your gameplay, because gameplay builds game literacy, and it helps you understand how games are constructed, what makes something fun for a particular audience, how rules are constructed, etc. So for those of you who are playing less frequently, why don't we try playing a quick game right now, and then we'll evaluate it together. So Steve is going to push out a link in the chat window for everyone. And he's also going to demo the game live so you can see it. And we're going to play it for about a minute. And I'm going to try really hard to get you all back after a minute. So Steve, you've got front invaders, and you're going to use your arrow keys and your space bar to play this game. And you might notice that this looks a lot like the old arcade game Space Invaders. And who doesn't want to shoot a little Microsoft Explorer character, because we've all been frustrated by Microsoft in the past. So go ahead real quickly, Stephen, hold down your up arrow and move your space bar to kind of shoot rapid fire so that they can kind of see how that works. And folks are probably having some fun with this. So play for another 20 seconds or so. And Steve is moving through the levels now on his own.
I played this yesterday in practice, full disclosure, so this isn't fair, but I'm still not super good. Notice if you shoot too many, the game takes points away from you as you're shooting, so you want to make sure you're trying to hit.
Yep, and you're moving up levels fairly quickly here, but it has definitely gotten harder from level 1 to level 3. And when I played this, I discovered it last week, I did not want to quit playing because I was incented to try to reach that next level. Okay, Steve, let's go ahead and come back to the slides.
I don't know if I want to.
This is a really simple game, and it's a good one to do a quick evaluation of what makes a game work. Let's get past that. So can anybody type in the question window what they think the game goal is? And whether you thought that was challenging. So one person said high hand coordination. That may be required, but that wasn't the game goal. So you're right, it's to kill the invaders, kill the aliens before they get to you. So that is right. How many of you thought that that was a fun challenge to do? Just kind of say fun, not fun. Yes, some thought it was really fun, loved it. Most people thought it was fun. And one because she hates IE, which I agree with. So you achieved that goal by shooting, by conquering, if you will. And that's kind of thought of as the core dynamic of a game. And it's something for you to pay attention to as you're building game literacy, because there are lots of different core dynamics that you could choose from. And most games will incorporate 1 to 3 core dynamics in the game. You'll either collect things, you'll acquire territory, you'll conquer an enemy, you'll race to the finish. And that's what you want to decide is fun. Is that going to be motivating and engaging to your learner in the process of going about and completing your learning game? What about rules? Game mechanics are rules. Can you identify one of the rules in this game? And no, there is no learning objective to this game. This is a game just for fun, and we advocate in the first step of game design to just play games that are for fun. You're exploring commercial games and learning what makes games interesting. So what was one rule in this game? Yes, scores diminish for missing points. If you shoot too fast, you'll miss points. There's strategy involved in it, which we're getting into with game elements. That's something you want to notice as you're evaluating games. What game elements are part of the game and how do they enhance the experience? So you guys can feel free to add your thoughts on the game elements you noticed, but one that stood out to me right away is levels. They use levels in a very big way, and they let you progress through a level very fast early, and then it's going to get more difficult as you progress in the game. The feedback is very obvious on the screen. You can see how you're doing by the number of little aliens that are remaining on the screen and how close those aliens are coming to you. So that is a quick example of how you do that first step of game design, which is to evaluate commercial games and identify the traits of those games, what's appealing about those games, what's possibly not appealing about those games, or difficult to understand. Then we go into step 2, and I'm going to turn it over to Karl and let him talk about exploring learning games.
Okay, thanks, Sharon. So one of the things that is important to consider is learning games after you look at some commercial games. So here's a number of different learning games. The grading game is a lot of fun. That actually takes something like grammar and turns grammar into a game, if you can believe that. And Robot Turtles is neat because it's actually for 4 to 8-year-olds. But the interesting thing about that is playing those kind of games gives you different insights into different game elements that you might be able to put into your learning game. So it's always important to take different types of games, play them, and develop that literacy. I had one game designer tell me one time, he's never created an original game. He's just taken pieces from other games and mashed them together and created a really kind of cool and interesting game. So that's what you need to think of when you do that. So what I'd like you to do now, and Steve will demonstrate for this, is a learning game. So similar to the game that we've already played, the commercial game, but now we'll do a learning game. So Steve's pushed that out. It's called Password Blaster, and I want you to go ahead and blast some passwords. So we'll see how well Steve knows his passwords. I can tell you all that one of Steve's passwords is actually in this game. So see if you can find it, and you can use it on Steve's computer someday. Okay, Steve, ready? Okay, I think he's just focused on the game. So the idea behind this game, and it's an important thing to point out as he's playing it, that Password Blaster is part of a larger curriculum. So when you think about a learning game, one of the things you really need to think about is not as a standalone entity. The research is pretty clear that it makes a lot of sense to kind of like the old I always tell people it's like the old Johnny Carson show, right? You need to set up the game, and Johnny would have on a movie star, and he would set up the movie star. Tell me about this movie clip. They would do the clip, and then he would debrief. You need to do that with learning games. You need to tell the learners what they can learn out of the game or what they're to look for out of the game. Allow them to experience the game and debrief them. You've got to have that reflection to make sure that the learning is transferable outside of the game environment. All right, Steve, that was great. Looks like a lot of fun. Let's try to get everybody back into the presentation.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So you can play that after you can play this game after the presentation as well. So that'll give you a chance to kind of do your homework. What we like about our stuff is that the homework is always fun, right? So can anybody write what the learning objective was of that particular game? Go ahead and do that in the questions. And I can see some people thinking about typing and some people typing. Yep, that's great. Okay, so basically the learning objective here, if you didn't see it on the screen, was to identify the traits of a strong password and distinguish between strong and weak passwords. Really important. So we had the game, which we had to blast the passwords as high up on the screen as possible, but ultimately we want people to learn about and know about passwords. On this screen here, and Steve will send out after the webinar, people always ask us, well, where can I find learning games? So there's a couple places. Nobelprize.org has taken Nobel Prize type of content and actually turned it into games. Games for Change is a great website. Not all of those games are either safe for work, so be careful, nor are they all about learning. Some are about attitudes and things like that. So be careful. But when you look, or if you want to change attitude, that's fine. But when you look through the games, look for ones that are related to learning. There's a really interesting website called Anatomy Arcade, which has a lot of little different games to teach you about anatomy and physiology. And there's an iCivics one that Sandra Day O'Connor actually helped sponsor. So you might say to yourself, well, yeah, Karl, this is great, but these are all kind of, not focused at my target audience. It's a little bit younger. But actually taking the concepts and ideas that they use can translate to an adult audience. So if you think of something like tic-tac-toe, very basic, almost a kid type game, right? But the same concepts and ideas are in Candy Crush, which is a game played by millions of people all over the world at all types of levels, and I would argue mostly at the adult level. So those concepts like alignment that's in tic-tac-toe can also be used in a game like Candy Crush. So just because the shell or the aesthetics or the outer doesn't look like, oh, this couldn't be adult, it can be very adult. In fact, one of the games in nobelprize.org is about drawing blood. So all these concepts are good to play and get ideas as you go through learning games. Here's another interesting learning game, and we'll send a link out for this. I like to show this because it's very simple and very straightforward. You have Will and Lisa. You'll get different patients, and basically they start at the top of the screen and start to move toward the bottom of the screen, and you've got to do certain things as a physician to help them before they perish. And it becomes really tense because you can see the characters, inching down the screen, and you're clicking on, should I run a test? Should I administer this antibiotic or this antibiotic? And if you administer the wrong one, they fall even faster. So it's really kind of an exciting environment, but a really simple interface. So oftentimes we think of like complicated games. I saw somebody's favorite game there, or the game they most recently played was Uncharted 4, which is an awesome game. I love Uncharted 4, but we don't have to create learning games that are quite that sophisticated. We can actually create more simpler games that are still a lot of fun and are not as development challenged, right? We don't have to do 3D and that kind of stuff, although I think it's very interesting. So things to evaluate when you look at games, and Sharon and I always say that after talking to us or reading our work or whatever, you will never enjoy games again. So I guess we should have gave that disclaimer early on. But basically, we want you to evaluate every game you play. What's the game goal? Is it challenging? What's the instructional goal? Did I actually learn what I was supposed to learn? What's the core dynamic? And is that linked to what I'm supposed to be learning? Sometimes we'll see people put things into like race to the finish, but their job has nothing to do with speed. Doesn't make sense. So we want to align core dynamics with learning goals. We want to look at the game mechanics, which are basically rules. So every time you see game mechanics, read game rules. Game elements, which are the aesthetics. How does it look? Is it cooperative? Is it competitive? And then feedback, obviously, a really important and powerful part of games. That's why we like feedback a lot. Okay, so now we're back to setting learning foundation, linking learning with the game design, and considering scoring and rewards. And Sharon's going to talk a little bit more about this particular part of the process. Sharon?
So I think the easiest way to talk about this is in the context of a specific example. So I'm going to give you one. And this is actually in chapter 6 of the book, where we were doing a project for an electronics manufacturer. And they had a very specific business need within their organization where they wanted to increase the parts sold per customer. And that's where any kind of a learning solution should start, right? It's because you're trying to support a business need. You're not just making a game because you think, oh gosh, we need an entertaining activity. You're trying to make a learning game that's in support of an actual business need or problem. And in this instance, they had a large group of independent sales representatives who had a very long line card of manufacturers whose parts they sold. And this entity wanted to increase the number of parts of theirs that got sold. So that was their business need. From that, we formulated an instructional goal where we wanted the players to be able to link relevant product families. We were talking about a manufacturer that has literally millions of SKUs of products. So getting those sales reps to a proficiency at the product application, technology, and product family level is what we were going for. Not every SKU that was sold, because that's too big, but their ability to start using the resources that this organization has to link relevant technologies and applications to specific customer types. So then we took a step back and formed a player persona. And a player persona is not the same thing as an audience analysis. So an audience analysis is part of creating a player persona. So I'm going to give you an example of what a player persona looks like, because they're very critical when you're making games. So they go deeper than that audience analysis that you might do, where you're kind of trying to get demographic information, you're trying to understand what they know now versus what they need to know. They paint a picture of the player, much as marketing companies use marketing personas to help them figure out how to advertise to a particular consumer segment. A player persona helps you think about how you're going to design your game to the people who are going to be playing it. So it paints a picture of the player, the constraints that that particular player has, the challenges in their work world, and the values that they hold that you might want to tap into. So you get a nice, strong visual image of who's playing your game. You may have multiple player personas, so one persona may not take care of you. So here's an example of a persona, and you can see that it's organized to kind of identify what are, so we now have a picture. It's not just this big mob of hundreds of people that are going to play our game. This is Stephanie, and Stephanie's 41, she has 2 kids, she's very on the go between her job and her personal life. I know how long she's been with the organization, what kinds of things she's done in that organization, what her key challenges are, what she values most. And critically, I also know what her sales call flow is like. So I can understand as I'm creating a game, how I'm going to map that game to her actual reality in the job. I know what a day in her life is like, and I also know what kind of devices and gaming experiences she's had in the past. So I get a mental picture of how she plays games now, so I don't go and try and create World of Warcraft for somebody who may only play Candy Crush casually on her phone. That then feeds into and helps me think about how I'm going to deliver on my learning objectives. So for my case study here, the learning objective was for them to be able to define each customer type that they might be selling to, so they can start to visualize, well, what kind of product applications might be relevant to that customer type. So this was one of the learning objectives in the game that we created. So what that ends up looking like when I start combining my learning needs plus my game design is a mobile game that looks like this. You'll see a territory map there on the left, and as a player, you're going to get to be mayor of your town. And as you tap on a plot in your town, you're going to get a description of a particular customer type. In this image here, it's a customer type called handheld devices. And I can see a very brief description of what a handheld device customer type might look like and consist of. And then I can go into a mini game called Hunt for Applications, where now that I know what the customer type is, can I hunt for applications for that customer type? And then on the image on the far right there, you'll see a grid that they're going to fill in if they're successful with their mini game. It gives them all the potential product applications that might be relevant to that customer type. And then you'll see some spaces there that represent other mini games that they could play that enable them to sell that particular product application to that customer. So it kind of builds on itself. Let's talk about how the game design choices we make link to the learning needs. There was a great question that came a bit ago where someone asked, well, is it appropriate to link my game rules and my core dynamic to the learning needs. Absolutely, that's exactly what you do want to do. So all of our game design decisions in TE Town, which is the name of the game, linked to some learning design need or some reality that we knew was true of for our target player. So we used two core dynamics repeatedly through this game. One was the build core dynamic. They were actually building a whole city, region at a time. And we also used the exploration core dynamic. They could go anywhere they wanted in this huge map, populating it as they wanted to. They were allowed to explore around to different customer types. And that correlated to the sales reps' real-world context where they're trying to build sales territories, and they're going to have several opportunities in progress at the same time. The mini game design decision was based on the constraint of limited time to play, a need to get in and out very quickly, and those games had a progression to them that enabled us to focus on that need in the learner to link product technologies to applications and applications to families. So there's a progression as you go through each mini game. We used the acquisition of treasury and population as scoring mechanisms in this game. So as you play through, you're building your population. As you build your population, your treasury goes. So we all pay taxes, and we know that that's how cities work. The bigger the city, the more taxes they collect. We felt like that gave us a nice theme of building a town and letting them be mayor, while also giving us great equivalency to the dollar goals and targets in their real world jobs. So it enabled a fantasy element, but that fantasy element did connect to what they knew in the real world. We did include leaderboards and levels in this game. That was intended to provide a social and a competitive component because our target was sales reps. And because in learning games, you always want any rewards to link to acquisition of knowledge and skill, those level progressions were a way for us to visually show achievement and mastery of content, because you couldn't be successful with a customer type until you'd mastered those product applications. So it was a great way to show how learning design and game design should be linked. And the use of the treasury and the population are representative of that step about considering your scoring and your rewards, and making sure your scoring decisions and your reward decisions in your design are supporting your learning design. So I'm going to let Karl talk about prototyping and playtesting and developing.
So one of the really important things about creating a learning game, or actually creating any kind of game, is making sure that you get it right. And we can plan and develop all we want, but a game creates the atmosphere for learning, but it doesn't actually create the learning. It creates the environment in which the learning has to occur, but doesn't actually create tangible outcomes until you experience and interact with the game. And as a developer, it's really hard to understand how a game's going to have an impact on a person until you watch them play it. And games, actually, it's been argued in the literature that games are actually situational cognition, meaning that every time you play a game, it's a little bit different because the situation changes. So think of it this way: if you play Trivial Pursuit, with some of your friends down, in the local bar, it's one game of Trivial Pursuit. If you play, let's say, up in a university in the Ivory Tower with a bunch of professors, it's a different kind of Trivial Pursuit. So basically, what we want to think about is, can we create a prototype to actually let people experience the game? So in our workshop, one of the things that we do very often is go through a process where we're a team basically, because most games are developed in teams, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But basically, we have a prototype where you create this prototype and you actually test out the game. And so prototyping, we feel, whether you're doing a computer-based game or a paper-based game, tabletop game, is really important. Here's a game where you need to take some keys, and this has to do with communication and timeliness and expectations, a game that was developed. I was actually doing a workshop last night with some Weeblos, scouts, and using the exact same process. Then here's one. People say, well, Karl and Sharon, that's great, but what about digital games? So here's some folks who've created a digital prototype, and we always say that the prototype needs to be the size of your screen. You can't take a big, huge piece of paper and say, yeah, we're designing this for a mobile device, because it's not congruent. Things fit on a big piece of paper that don't fit on a mobile device. So we are strong advocates of paper prototyping. The other thing a lot of people will say, or some people will say, not a lot, but some people will say, hey, I can program much faster than paper. Let me go ahead and program it. I know all the programming stuff. But what we find is that if you make a fundamental assumption in the programming that is not correct, like let's say that you use a race to the finish type of dynamic rather than an outwit dynamic, or a dynamic where you want somebody to construct something. Well, to change that fundamental coding is really, really difficult. So people will tend to work around that dynamic that they've already coded. Well, somehow we can make it into a race to the finish. I'm not sure how, but I think we could do that. But we find with paper, people are like, all right, forget it. Rip up the paper and start over again. It's not a big deal. It's low cost, it's low risk, and it's low psychological investment. So paper prototyping works really well. And what can you learn from a paper prototype? Well, lots of stuff, right? You can learn how effective your game is for helping people learn what you want them to learn after they play the prototype. You can say, okay, did you learn anything? What did you learn? What were the learning outcomes? Do you feel that you have more knowledge now than you did previously, or more behavioral knowledge? So it doesn't actually have to be knowledge. It could be behavior, skills, all kinds of things. And then how engaging was the game to the learners? And we call learning games fun enough, right? We're not trying to create Assassin's Creed 4, although that is a great game. What we're really trying to do is make it engaging enough for the learner to be involved in the process and understanding what's going on in that game space. So making sure that it's fun enough is a really good thing to think about. Then we want the effectiveness of the game elements. How does chance work? Most games do really well with chance, so we want to have an element of chance in the game. How does the turn work? What does the person it's not their turn, what do they do? So those are some elements, or what do they think about? Those are some elements to consider. How clear are the rules? And that's a big deal, because we don't want a lot of cognitive overhead on the rules. And then we also want to make sure that the cognitive overhead of the game is not too high. Are you trying to figure out, okay, now I do 5 things here, and then it's somebody else's turn, but I can steal their turn if I do this? That's too much, right? You want it very simple, so people are focusing on the learning, not on the rules of the game. But it is important to think about, when you think about the rules of the game, the more time somebody plays the game, the more they'll internalize the rules and the better the learning. So games actually are really, really good for learning when they're played multiple times. And then finally, how complex is the game to produce? You might say, yeah, we thought it was going to be easy. I was at a workshop, I think at Learning Solutions, and the team developed a game. They said, yeah, we could never do this by hand. It's going to have to use some type of computer-based scoring because it's so complex. That might be a good thing, the complexity. I've seen games where you do a hybrid. So you have a board game, but you put the scores or the moves into an Excel spreadsheet, and that gives you the score at the end of every round. So that's perfectly acceptable. But you just have to know, is that something that we want in our environment, or is it better to simplify the scoring so that we don't have to use Excel, something like that? And there's that Microsoft theme again, isn't it? So how do you create a prototype? Well, you don't need much. All you need is paper, scissors, some crayons or markers, tape. We also will buy some little game pieces. You can get game pieces on Amazon very inexpensively. You can get dice on Amazon. You can get spinners, all that kind of stuff, and just kind of put them out in the room and let people gravitate toward what they need. I find the supplies that people use most, and actually I neglected to put it on here, are actually index cards. Index cards are used a whole lot as are Post-it notes. So really just getting people viscerally working with the game. And again, even if it's an online game, it works pretty well to go through this process. Okay, so once you've got the game concept, kind of done and you created a prototype, you need to do some testing. And so there's really three levels of testing that we talk about. So one level is a concept test. And this is done really during the early phases of playtesting. And it's when your own design team plays the game to see how it works. You discuss, elements of the game that you can improve. Does the initial design work? Do the game mechanics work? Do the elements work? At this stage, you could even change a couple things and see the result. We always say if something's not working, take something away and see if the game still works. That way you can tell what is impacting the playability and what's not. So after the concept test, then you might want to go to an outside group to run a test as well. Because no matter how much you try to be objective, if it's a game you've developed, you're going to like it a lot. And you might not see problems, or you might make assumptions that an outside group won't make. So once you've kind of fixed your game, decide on a group of outside play testers and allow them to go through the game. Maybe 5 or 6 people who would represent your target players. Because if you rely on one person, one target player, is in maybe your design team, is it just their opinion, or is this an overall issue that you need to look at? And we found pretty much that 5 or 6 people, as long as they're representative of most of the people who will be playing the game, will pretty much uncover most of the issues. So you don't need to play it with thousands of people. Basically, a big handful of folks are good for giving you the feedback, allowing you to calibrate that feedback to find out, yes, it's multiple people, and go that way. Then the final play testing, but can be multiple stages, is what we call the beta play testing. So this is actually with your target audience, and you might have several iterations of the game that they go through, or maybe one game, but it depends really on how complex your game is. For a simple tabletop game, you might have one pilot session, but for a digital game, you might have several iterations before you find one that, yeah, that works. At this point, the testers really should reflect your audience, and what they're going to do is play the game almost like a complete game. It should look like the game with no missing features. It should have the right level of fidelity, and it should look really good. And when I was developing a game called Zombie Sales Apocalypse, and it has 3D animations and interactions and all that kind of stuff, we wanted a tutorial, but being a game designer, we kind of saved the tutorial for last because we didn't know what the game would look like. So we actually took screen captures and used PowerPoint actually, and made it clickable so people could experience a low level fidelity tutorial, but then get into the high fidelity game, because we knew we might have to change the tutorial based on what the feedback was from the game. So we beta tested it once with that kind of tutorial, and then we found out what worked, and then we created the tutorial, and then we beta tested it again, or beta plus one tested it, I guess. And so that's really the concept of playtesting. And we find that iteration is really the secret sauce to making a good learning game. And lots of people don't like to think about the iteration, but the iteration really kind of helps. And here's an example of an early concept test. And then people often ask us who is on the team. And we really have, it depends, but most of the time you want somebody to manage the project, of course, an instructional designer or writer, so you get the instructional integrity. You also want a game designer. It doesn't have to be a formal game designer, but somebody that knows games and understands game literacy is really important. Sometimes it can be the instructional designer, sometimes not. It depends on the size of the team and the complexity of the game. Artist is really good. Don't ever underestimate the value of a good artist. They add so much to the game, and it doesn't mean the game has to be high fidelity. There's a big comeback of 8-bit games, which make games really lots of fun to play. So it doesn't have. It has to be consistent and congruent art, but it doesn't have to be the most realistic. Obviously, you need a programmer or a developer, and of course, quality assurance. And then one other thing to think about are the templates or the tools that you're going to use. So there's a trade-off. Always there's a trade-off, right? If we want highly customized games, they're harder to use the languages and the tools. So if you use a game template like something around a Wheel of Fortune type of game, or Who Wants to Be a Millionaire type of game, or lots of different templates that you can buy, you can stick in content, but it doesn't necessarily give you a lot of customization. You could do some, and the tools are getting much better, the authoring tools with some game development and variables and things like that. With the authoring tools, you're still a little bit limited. Game engines, in fact, today, Construct 3 just released their beta. So you can try out Construct 3, which is a great tool that both Sharon uses and I use to create really engaging games. Gives you lots of flexibility. And then finally, you could get to the programming level and really create any kind of flexibility that you want. But of course, giving up flexibility, you'll certainly give up ease of use. So you just need to consider those trade-offs, what the budget is, the size of the game, what you're trying to teach, and all of those things are something that needs to be considered. So that brings us to the last element in our 9 steps, and that's deploy. And I'll turn it back to Sharon to talk about deployment of learning games.
I have to laugh, Karl. Thank you, because I said it's often the forgotten step or the stuff that we don't allow sufficient time for. And I note that we only have a few minutes left in our webinar here, and I don't want anyone to correlate the amount of time that we're giving it here to the amount of time you should be focusing on it as you're going through a game design and development process. Success only comes when 3 ingredients are present. The first is you have to have a meaningful, relevant game experience. So thumbs up that you write something that has good learning value and is relevant to your learners, but that's only one piece of it. The next thing is to have a comprehensive logistics plan. And most people, when they're doing games initially, underestimate logistics. That is a rollout schedule for you that makes you think about the timeline, working backwards from when you want people actually playing this game to what has to happen before you launch it, once you launch it, and after you launch it. Expecting that because you're going to push out a link to a digital game, everyone's going to go out and play it and be jazzed about it is probably a recipe for not having that successful of a gameplay. You need to think carefully about what's going to happen and thinking through activities that you're going to use to support each one of those phases. You need to think through the specifics of distribution and delivery. So when I showed you that player persona and I had to think about the devices that people would be playing that mobile game on, how are they going to gain access to that mobile game? We ended up making it available for download off of the iOS App Store and Google Play, and put the barrier to downloading and playing very, very low because these were independent sales reps. And to have any kind of a registration process or gatekeeping process, it felt like the risk of people saying too much effort was much more significant than any kind of a security risk that people perceived there being. You need to think through tactics for mitigating those risks and barriers to play and how you're going to do it. And that kind of involves that third component, a marketing and communication plan. So thinking through what your messages are going to be, what your incentives might be, the imagery and branding that you're going to use, the distribution channels that you're going to use, etc. And I see a question on here, is effective evaluation part of deployment? Let's just take a look at that, Elizabeth. So there's factors that you're going to think about as you're putting this together, and yes, evaluation is going to be part of that. So you want to ask if it's just a single game or a gamified approach or across a single initiative, how is that game helping you achieve business and learning goals, and how are you going to measure that success? What reactions should you anticipate from learners, from the learners' managers, from the stakeholders inside the organization, and how do you manage those and adjust your messaging based on that? What realities exist that are going to affect your implementation? How do those influence the game elements that you're going to emphasize or leverage as you're promoting the game? What kind of effort, time, skill, and planning are required to produce your game? So Karl showed you that matrix on ease of creation versus customization. You are going to be thinking about what do you want to do based on what you want and your goals Are you going to go with the templated approach? Are you going to invest in programmers? How are you going to handle that? If you're going into a more gamified ecosystem, or you're going to go across initiatives or a major initiative, you have to think about, how am I going to maintain long-term interest in gameplay or keep things fresh over the long term? What constraints are going to limit the frequency with which I want people to be playing? What analytics and data can that game solution provide to me to showcase benefits and give an evaluation of the game's effectiveness as a learning solution and in solving that business problem? Who needs to see that data? How's that data going to be used? Those are all factors that you have to consider. That takes us right to the top of the hour. And Steve, I'll turn it back over to you if you want to do any final wrap up or questions.
Yeah, so if you have a question for Sharon and Karl, we might have time for one or two here if you're able to stay just a little bit after. As those questions are coming in, I want to send out a couple more links to you here. Obviously, we've been talking about Sharon and Karl's book, Play to Learn. I just sent you a link where you can learn more about that book. And there is a promo code there on the screen. If you are interested in purchasing it, you can do so for 10% off through the ATD store with that code. And then this last link here that I want to send to you, in the spirit of gameplay and also in the spirit of instructional design and reinforcement, Sharon and Karl created a game with our Knowledge Guru learning platform that reinforces the content covered in the book and in this webinar. So if you'd like to check that out, see another example of kind of a hybrid between a game template system and an authoring system, you can do that and play that game at the link while you're reviewing the content. So I won't speak for Sharon and Karl here. I know that they are, we've all have things to do here, but we're at the very end of the hour, and if one or both of them can stick around, I see, well, the number one question I'm seeing here is, can we obtain a copy of the presentation? And yes, to ease everyone's mind, we will be sending a recording out for you along with all of the different links that were sent out, the games that were discussed, and an invitation to our next webinar here in this series. So, and also I would be remiss if I didn't say that Sharon and Karl will be they'll be doing 2 more sessions of their all-day Learning Game Design Workshop, one in June in San Diego and another in September in Chicago. So those events are coming up if you're interested in getting a full day experience with this content. Great. Well, I'm not seeing any questions. I think we've done a good job of answering them throughout the webinar. So thank you everybody for your time and attention. Thank you, Sharon and Karl, for sharing your insights with us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for attending.
Really
Appreciate
appreciate your time.